pleasure for me to introduce our speaker, Barbara Hoff, who has a degree in History and Knowledge at the University of Zurich and is now a postdoc at University of Lausanne at the Department of Language and Information Sciences, so very close to the place where we are now today. Her work focuses on the main research focus of Barbara Hoff is the role of science and technology in international relations. She has been working on the history of the use of technology in education so far, but she's now working on two different projects. The first one focuses on the use of computers in the physical sciences and how the use of computers changed the practices in doing research in physics from the 1960s to the 1990s. And the second of her projects is the early history of fusion science in Europe, which is the topic of the talk she will give today. And it's to pursue this research topic that she has been invited as a visiting scholar at our Centers Thesaurus for the month of October. So members of the Thesaurus Centers are now starting a pre-PNR project on the scientific and political history of European cooperation on controlled nuclear fusion energy research, with the goal to use this historical research for informing large-scale surveys on public opinion on nuclear energy in various European countries. This is the goal of the PRIN project. I am the PI of the project, and in the context of this new research agenda, which will start in November, we have invited Barbara Hoff to discuss these topics, which are of course very relevant for two main issues: the problem of technology, the role of technology in international relations, in particular for what is now called science diplomacy, and for the topic of energy transition. So the talk of Barbara Hoff will intersect these two main topics, which are of interest for the project of the rest of the talk. So thanks, Barbara, and then the floor is yours.
Thanks for this kind introduction. Let me start with two just short remarks. The first, thanks a lot for inviting me. It's a great pleasure. I really enjoy it here. It's a good city. And it's a nice collaboration also that we started, and the center is really interesting people. So thanks a lot. It's a good chance for me. Second, so as you see on the slides already, I'm from the University of Lausanne, and something about my biography. I grew up in Switzerland, so when I started my PhD, my interest was immediately like history of CERN. So this is a kind of the topic as well today. So Lausanne is, you can imagine, 50 kilometers from Geneva. It's 40 minutes. It's like 40 minutes by train. The same lake for swimming. So this is a great thing. So the topic today and the presentation focus on CERN history. And the talk that I'm going to give is a work in progress. So it's a paper that I'm currently writing for an article. It's like half of it is completed. And it's more like an invitation to talk and discuss also with people who are not historians. So it's not about the historical topic, and I'm not the expert here who just wants to give answers and you ask questions, but also I would like to suggest some problems that we should all be more aware of. So, micro moment in history of CERN. That's how I call it this as an introduction. So I start with some very general backgrounds to better frame the historical case and connect this to the present. Nuclear fusion as a source of stellar energy has been studied since the early interwar period. So it preceded the discovery of nuclear fission by several years. Controlled nuclear fusion is designed to combine atomic nuclei and thereby release energy. This graphic from a text by Matteo Barbarino, who is a fusion expert of the International Atomic Energy Agency, illustrates that energy is produced in the process of fusing deuterium with tritium. And this is that's quite the fundamental knowledge that they have since a long time. During the Second World War, research into fission of uranium and plutonium was promoted and given high priority, and this led, as you all know, to atomic weapons. In 1950, however, the US government authorized the development of the so-called H-bomb, a nuclear fusion-based weapon against protest from leading physicists. The Soviet Union, the UK, soon followed the United States. In the early stage of the Cold War, fusion studies were classified and conducted in secret. But in 1958, the leading fusion nations, these three, decided to publish information of non-military relevance, and Cold War studies show that this release of information was not just for free, but also they had a huge interest in new nations and kind of sharing knowledge with countries to gain new allies. The decision to reveal the secrets of fusion propagated at the Second Atmosphere Peace Conference in Geneva in September 1958 was promoted in-depth discussion of new achievements, and this was really a watershed in the history of fusion. So 1958 is really an important date for history of fusion. Today, fusion energy is viewed as a potential clean energy source, superior to polluting energy sources such as fossil fuels, and safer than uranium. That's how they call it. In the future, it could help to meet the increasing energy demand and combat climate change. But we see there are many hopes that fusion energy becomes a game-changing technology. But today, no fusion reactor has been developed that can produce energy for consumers. Being discussed for decades since the interwar period, but always seeming to be out of reach, comments in the media are often that the future of fusion is still in the future. History shows that hopes have often alternated with disappointment. So there was kind of a hype cycle, these kind of hopes, disappointments, and so on. And this like hopes and disappointment cycles in fusion is a very important point why the fusion research should be discussed. My aim today is to present a historical case to highlight some of the challenges facing fusion research. International cooperation and the coordination of different scientific programs is a problem that has been highlighted in many previous historical studies. I will show that in 1958, the integration of different techno-scientific approaches posed a particular challenge that can be described with the analytical categories of cooperation, coordination, and competition. To illustrate why techno-scientific competition matters, let's take a look at current developments before we go back in time. Since the 60s, two methods to contain a stable plasma, which is a precondition for fusion, shaped the scientific discourse. One is magnetic confinement and the other is inertial confinement. Magnetic confinement is the scientific method promoted at the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, which is currently built in southern France. That's very reductive, what I say, but as the name suggests, the reactor will use magnets, which you see here on this picture. The idea is to use ITER for developing fusion applications in the future. The other, and you see it from the title here, is promoted as an alternative and has received high attention 2 years ago when it was claimed that a milestone has been reached. This method here is laser-based, so magnetic-based laser-based. Since about a decade, fusion energy is also explored by startups which are eager to achieve and later profit from the game-changing technology of fusion. So they are building smaller devices, which illustrates well the competitive situation in the field. And I just put the link here, but I think it could be very interesting to just analyze YouTube videos to see and compare these startup companies and what they exactly do at the moment. But as a historian, I travel now back in time with you. But to recapitulate, fusion has a longer history than fission and has a problematic connection to the prophecy that the breakthrough is just around the corner. Whereas in reality, there is still much fundamental research going on for which competition seems necessary to identify working solutions. Research on fusion is telling about potential energy transition, the involvement of different collective actors, divergent interests, and the challenge of what kind of science to be supported and how. Today we will delve into the pioneering years of fusion science and the hopes it raised in 1958. My title, Fusion Imperfect, has a double connotation. For one, it illustrates futuristic visions that didn't work out the way it was believed. But more importantly, it is to show that attempts to coordinate between European international organizations were quite troublesome. More precisely, and for our purpose today, it is important to keep in mind that the 1958 was the early phase of European integration with the Euratom and the OECD's Nuclear Energy Agency, INEA, at this time still a European organization, were founded almost at the same time. These organizations began to support science and development of nuclear energies. Adding to that, also the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna was founded, which is fully dedicated to that field. Not fusion, but fission and fusion, so just nuclear energy technologies. Barbara Curlew is here today. She studied the Euratom programs in this period and shows that Euratom coordinated between national projects and pushed for a European policy providing funding via associated contracts. She also shows that, interestingly and little surprising, there was a short attempt to collaborate with the European Organization for Nuclear Research, CERN, in Geneva. How CERN came into the picture is worth a story of its own. Today, CERN is known for the world's largest accelerator, the LHC. In 1958, CERN only existed for 4 years, with its first high-energy accelerator, the proton synchrotron, still under construction. As you shall see, the short-lived exchange between Euratom and CERN is more telling about the history of CERN than of Euratom. It allows conclusions to be drawn about both competition for leadership in an emerging field and competition between different branches of physics. So, just as a teaser, in the following I will, on the one hand, elaborate why it was difficult for CERN to have strings to Euratom, and on the other hand, I will show that plasma physics was pushed back at CERN in favor of expanding high-energy physics. This was done quite successfully as larger and larger accelerators were built, as you see on the picture here of today's LHC, which is this like 27 kilometers distance. And when you go this way, it's Lausanne, that's where I live. And the lake is really beautiful, and I can say go swimming there. So, in 1958, CERN only existed for 4 years. No, that's what I said. So the LHC here, and what I will gonna show in my forthcoming results of my study, this is to fill a gap not only in the history of fusion, but also in the history of CERN, which is an oft-cited prototype of science diplomacy and of high-profile cooperation. Drawing on archival sources, my talk, which is, as said, a work in progress and covers only half of the article that I'm writing, focuses on the initiative taken at CERN in an interplay of, and now I'm going to show this because this is quite important to understand how the CERN is governed inside. So what you see on the left is only like the LEC. This initiative taken at CERN must be seen in an interplay between the CERN Council, which is the superior governing body composed of country representative, country members of CERN, the scientific committee of CERN, it's an advisory board, the directors and CERN scientists. I will illustrate how these three parties, the council members, established scientists and young in-house physicists, had to come to terms on whether or not CERN should do plasma physics, and if so, in collaboration with Euratom. Matteo Barbarino shows that at the Atoms for Peace conference in 1958, 4 basic methods were presented for controlling thermonuclear fusion reactions. Roughly speaking, we can say there were the USSR tokamak, the USSR magnetic mirror, the UK pinch, and the US stellator. So these were like similar principles, but by the competing 3 nations. As there has been little official exchange, some ideas were just duplicated. Empirical research was done on a trial and error basis with little to no communication between group projects. And what is still missing in historical research is studies of spying in the field of fusion. The declassification of information made it possible to set up coordination and collaboration between competing projects. Today I only focus on CERN, although East-West exchange was also promoted. What we see in the CERN meeting documents is that the competing methods, except the tokamak, which I don't know why, were carefully evaluated against each other in an open discussion, but without conclusion in terms of a select of a method, also because CERN discontinued its support after a very short trial episode. So let's begin at the beginning. How did CERN become involved in fusion? Preceding the Atoms for Peace conference and carried by euphoria that information would soon be released enabling fusion studies to flourish, in April 1958, the French diplomat François de Rose, president of the CERN Council, informed the CERN Committee of Council, which is a joint panel of Council, Scientific Committee, and the CERN's in-house manager, so this is really a powerful body. They informed him that he had been approached by Louis Armand, president of the Euratom. The 2 Frenchmen had discussed the possibility of forging links between the newly founded Euratom and CERN in fundamental studies. According to a previous study by Dominique Bestre, it was on the advice of CERN Director General Cornelis Baker that de Rose suggested the common exploration in plasma physics. Bestre also shows that preceding this meeting for a month, the head of CERN's proton synchrotron division, the English researcher John Adams, on this picture here, was approached by European specialists on fusion who asked to organize a meeting which was held in March 1958. The arguments used to support plasma physics were similar to those used when CERN was set up earlier in the decade, namely Europeans were behind and required significant financial investment to catch up with the Americans. The 2 initiatives were fused in the planned so-called Euratom-CERN Joint Study Group for Fusion Research, which, although highly ambitious, became a paper tiger without practical enforcement. In May 1958, a meeting was held between European representative Guéron, which is not on the picture, and Adams and Baker to discuss the possibilities of setting up a joint study group to consider European fusion research programs. The most outstanding point was not only to consider the state of the art, but also to make suggestions of how research could be carried out either by existing national research centres or by further development of some of these centres or by the creation of a European centre. CERN thus served as a model for international collaboration and was likewise considered as a potential candidate to conduct research on behalf and under contract of Euratom. It was suggested that the joint study group should take up work in July, thus 2 months before the Atoms for Peace conference, and remember, that was the point where they declassified a lot of information. And it was planned that this joint study group would have monthly meetings. The idea was to gather information and write a report submitted to both organizations. Costs for the work would be covered 2/3 by Euratom and 1/3 by CERN. CERN should be represented by Atoms and 2 staff members of the proton synchrotron division, Arnold Schock and Chigi Linhart. While the proton synchrotron was still under construction, it was clear that the accelerator would start to operate in 1960, so 2 years later, for the experimental physicists to generate data for analysis, right? So at that point in time, it is important to realize that the physicists who were hired at CERN since 1952 to develop accelerators were now beginning to explore other topics and new options. This is evident from their publications. In short, it was not only institutional interest and a top-down implementation, but also curiosity that was spreading around among several CERN physicists. In 1958, CERN staff members were already exploring plasma physics, precisely the proton synchrotron research group tasked with setting up CERN's accelerator to study fundamental matter. In fact, plasma physics was one of the main fields that Adams' division reported to the meeting of the scientific committee in May 1958. It was shortly after the Committee of Council had been invited to consider the feasibility of international cooperation with the joint work either taking place at CERN or in a separate organization. Director General Baker presented this group of leading physicists that the Committee of Council had decided to approach Europe informally. However, the proposal met with reservation. For instance, Representative Werner Heisenberg argued that plasma physics would need a new machine. The British Patrick Blackett, and also doing advisory work to CERN, so this is really the scientific committee, which is the advisory board of CERN, so not the practical, not the people working at the accelerators, but the people who meet and say what scientific programs should be conducted. So Patrick Blackett, he pointed out that there were practical aims attached to plasma physics and fusion studies, so CERN would run into problems of ownership and patents. In response, Director General Baker put to the record that, quote, any cooperation in which CERN might be engaged should not affect the research work with the accelerators and should not change CERN's policy of being a completely open institute. In other words, the potential plasma program had to be carefully considered so as not to contradict the CERN Convention of 1953, which restricted work to purely fundamental research with results to be published. So, the chairman of the scientific committee, you should know him, I think, he's very familiar to most Italians, I think, Eduardo Amaldi, he took the view that it was possible to keep practical applications outside a joint effort. In the end, the CERN Scientific Committee approved setting up a joint study group with participation and money from Euratom. So they said, okay, let's go for joint work with Euratom. But the CERN-Euratom study group never came into being as intended because of concerns raised in debates of the CERN Council, representing the interest of the member states. The Council met twice in June 1958. After the first meeting, the Council was split down the middle because of the veto of representatives of the non-Euratom states. The Euratom at that time included the Federal Republic of Germany, France, Italy, and Benelux. So the other parts, so 12 countries, it means 6 pro, 6 against. The Scandinavians and Yugoslavia refused to vote as their governments had not yet had time to study the proposal for a collaboration. The United Kingdom asked that the aims of the study group be restricted, so it was not about coordinating programs or building new laboratories. And Switzerland and Greece proposed an amendment which affirmed that the non-member states of Euratom would not be committed by the conclusions reached by the group. The Swiss delegation agreed to set up a study group, but they suggested that the results should be discussed in the framework of the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, today OECD, of which Switzerland was a member, but not of Euratom. Faced with this result, an extraordinary session of the Council was convened a week later. The proposal discussed was that in view of the current importance of the fundamental aspects of nuclear research in its bearing on problems of fusion phenomena, a study group should be set up as soon as possible to survey the present position and make recommendations, with CERN's present association having no involvement or commitment for the future. The Danish delegate suggested that what was then actually made, a study of the present state and carried out and writing a report to the Council. The British delegation made it clear that the study group shall only survey the present situation and make recommendations for the future, but not conduct any research, and that their recommendations were not binding member states in respect of national interests. The UK was quite strong in fusion, as you may remember, but what's also important is that they were very protective as they had plans for their own fusion laboratory. Further, the UK delegation amended that both the Euratom and the Eurocities ENIA could send observers to participate at the study group. The Council found this proposal now very useful, and they adopted it and started this fusion research group. But this fusion research group was now conducted by CERN alone with observers. It was decided premature to consider if research under discussion was within the provision of the convention. So the Council approved the study group to gather information, particularly in view of the Atoms for Peace conference in September, so like 2 months later. The group was restricted to science-based advisory work to develop recommendations on how fusion could develop and be promoted in Europe. One minor issue is interesting, however. Although this was never mentioned, also representatives of the United States were invited as observers, which suggests that either the Council decision was bypassed or steps were taken later, but only informally. From summer 58 to March 59, the date when it submitted its report to the Council, this group, now without Euratom or Euratom only as observer, and also OECD sent an observer and the United States sent an observer, they met 3 times. Shortly after the Atoms for Peace conference to assimilate the new information. In mid-December to evaluate options, discuss European work, and also if they should set up a new laboratory. And in early March 59 to discuss the draft report. As we shall see, in that short time, enthusiasm for expanding collaboration was radically damped. No central laboratory, no coordination of activities, not even a plasma study division was set up at CERN. Yet the original study group remained a point of contact for exchanging ideas. The first meeting in September 1958 illustrates that consideration was given to the diverse technical and methodological approaches with a review of the devices presented and discussed at the Atoms for Peace conference. However, it became clear that too little time had elapsed since the general release of information for any serious evaluation of the state of the art. It was therefore agreed that the study group members would undertake to write surveys. The second meeting was to review these results compared with the work being undertaken in the United States and the Soviet Union, and to discuss the question of a European laboratory for fusion problems. Following this, Chairman Adams drafted a summary report. The third meeting focused on these conclusions, followed by status reports of group members. And why I call it plasma versus high energy physics becomes now clear in what was concluded from the report. The draft report was presented to the scientific committee before submission to the council. Adams recalled that a year before people did not know whether they simply duplicated work. And I think that's important. That was the reason why a study group was set up. This is important. It shows how potential competing attempts were excluded by producing an overview as a condition for potential collaboration and coordination between projects. The reports written by Adams then detailed the activities of European laboratories working on fusion, revealing that most work in Europe was still on a planning stage, which made it important to consider whether and how programs could be interlocked. An important observation was that coordination between programs was now emerging. While the report stressed that CERN was not engaged in fusion studies, Adams reported that a small group of the proton synchrotron division was studying the problem of electrons moving in plasma experimentally and theoretically, and ultra-high vacuum technology as part of accelerator research, but also important for plasma physics. So there was a line drawn now between plasma physics, as now seen a fundamental study, and fusion, seen as a sought for application field. The third part brought to light that the first hype had been damped shortly before the Atoms for Peace conference, when it became clear that there was no quick breakthrough achieved in producing a fusion reactor. Concluding from this, Adams suggested that the field needed more fundamental studies to understand the physics of plasma. Adams also considered that it had to be combined with experimental and technological studies and integrate the work of small research teams and national and industrial groups. One of the most important questions discussed was whether there should be a European laboratory for fusion problems to continue the initiative. While CERN certainly served as a model for European integration, biasing considerations in this world region, in Europe, for instance, because the United States, they never considered to centralize fusion studies. Things just didn't work the way it was all developed in high energy physics, with CERN as a central for this field. The report clearly pointed out that the idea of a European laboratory was not meant as a replacement of the existing and planned national laboratories. The study group did not deem it necessary to set up a central European laboratory for fusion work at the moment. With the final version of the report, CERN's work came to an end. The report was considered at the council session in May 1959, thus only a year after the idea had been born. It was proposed and agreed to set up a follow-up study group to continue the exchange for a limited time under CERN sponsorship until kind of an alternative was found, while no more thoughts were given on setting up a laboratory or conduct studies at CERN. It is important to note that Director General Baker now recommended against having CERN involved, as he warned that this would draw CERN into closer responsibility for work which had a definitely commercial and strategic importance. This again shows how important the statement of the CERN Convention was for the first generation of researchers, which they clearly took the view that no practical work should be done at CERN. This changed in the 70s, by the way. Adams, in turn, undertook the necessary steps to set up a European society to continue the exchange, which illustrates how central he became for the emerging research field. He also considered that CERN would not make any real contribution to the scientific direction of the work of the study group, as, to quote him, "As for this, CERN had to maintain a staff actively engaged in fusion work, which was likely not to be the case, as the plasma work at present being done in the accelerator research group would gradually tail off." So, in fact, there were concerns that the proton-synchrotron division would be dispersed by fusion work. However, this was not the case. Instead, group members soon had to reorient their activities because of the decision, as announced, to expand high-energy physics and build new accelerators in the future 1960s. CERN stood at a crossroad, as it was becoming clear that the US were building an accelerator able to provide higher energies than CERN. So remember, you've seen the picture of the LHC, like how bigger and bigger the accelerators have become. Hence, the decision against plasma physics was one for high-energy physics in a period when CERN also faced difficulties in maintaining funding levels. In addition, Adams left CERN in '61 for a new post, and guess what it was? He became the first director of a laboratory for plasma physics in the United Kingdom. So, to conclude, fusion remained a national affair, but it was coordinated by the Euratom. As seen, activities at CERN did not foster the founding of another joint European laboratory. No CERN remodeling, but instead the centrifugal tendencies for strict national control were reinforced. The Euratom took over, but rather for a while it was a coordinator of fusion research, not integrator, while CERN supported for a while a follow-up fusion group, which only met until 1964. And Euratom's attempts to have a central fusion laboratory was kind of, I think in the late 70s, they set up like larger institutions with Euratom. But before it was, I think Barbara Cooley knows more about that, more like national funding structure of national laboratories. So far, what insights does the historical case offer for discussion? I would say that first, it shows that in 1958, the best methods had to be identified from the considerations for achieving fusion reactions previously developed in secret. That's why it is no coincidence that a study group was set up. Second, several international organizations were trying to gain a foothold in the emerging research field, so leadership roles had to be defined. And third, it was not just a matter of getting it right in terms of collaboration and coordination. Fusion studies also had to compete with other areas of physics for limited resources. Fusion research predominantly falls into the domain of professional physicists, but physicists do not necessarily support the same idea. So in the example of CERN, you see that high energy was the winner. So to close, fusion research still offers us today many unresolved puzzles. What is certainly not helpful, in my understanding, is the widespread belief in the linear model of advancement in which science produces results that can readily translate it into technology. and within a time span of 5 to 30 years, which seems a very futuristic claim. Or, just as a reminder, compare these statements from a title from the International Atomic Energy Agency in 21, Fusion Ready when Society Needs It, with a claim made at the Atoms Peace Conference in 71. Mankind can have thermonuclear reactors when it needs them. And 58, the year that you learned a lot about, it will take 20 or more years to make a fusion reactor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the survey of the early history of fusion research in Europe. Are there comments and questions? Also, what this historical case might imply for the present situation? Is it closed? Now it's open. Okay, sorry. Are there questions or comments or concerning the?
So yeah, if I may, yeah, exactly. I mean, following up on Roberto's point, what does this tell us regarding the current situation of cooperation or competition regarding fusion, and actually what kind of, in a sense, I mean, at the Zeus Research Center, I mean, we study let's say, the impact of technology on society, but we also try to draw, let's say, policy recommendations, right? And the idea is, so the question would be, I mean, what can we learn from this in terms of, let's call it, possibly scientific policy recommendations regarding scientific cooperation?
How does it work? No, I have to push here, right?
No, nothing sure.
Okay, so perfect. Yeah, thanks. I think that's the main question. What we can offer as historians is like examples to kind of, I would say, take a more broad perspective on what's really happening. And I think CERN is a small case, but an interesting one, because it shows exactly that there are competing ideas. And how do you develop the kind of the best method? How do you show which one is going to be the winner? So what can you recommend then as the best practice and the attempt that potentially is going to be the one that's going to make it? I think this is important. So it's, for us, I would say, historians of science, important to study how they decide which one is the best, how they exchange their views, how they meet, how they collaborate, how collaboration worked, how they failed to work, to understand and maybe also see how this could potentially be similar in the present. For instance, as I've shown, there's like two main competing systems at the moment. So should funding now go in one direction, or should it go in the other? Or should we all invest in startup companies who are testing smaller device? This is not the answer that I can give you, but I think this is just important to think about, because there are similarities in 58 where they had competing devices, and they needed to say this one is the best or this one is not. And this is the best way to collaborate and exchange, and this not. So in 58, for example, what was important to realize, secret is not good. If we exchange use, it's going to be helpful to not duplicate work, because this doesn't make sense. If we all invest in one and the same technology, we're just going to lose money. So I think this is important. So these are kind of lessons that history can offer us, I think. But it's not to me to say, so I'm going to do the recommendations. I think that's not my job, but just to show and tell what history can reveal to us.
Thanks. In fact, it's very complicated from history go to the policy recommendation. I think that this is a very interesting research question we can actually try to do. How history can this is one of the main questions also of our pre-PNR research project. So it's an historical, it's mostly historical work, but it should arrive at some sort of information for policymakers concerning at least the communication of the particular agenda to the public, because this is the main point. I don't know if Francesco is here, but okay. CERN is a specific case, of course, but it's a very important one in '58. So my question would be: now CERN is out of fusion. It's no longer in fusion. In '58, what were the? Now we have a completely different situation concerning the hope that community might have about fusion energy, because there are much more pressures, especially concerning the consciousness about climate change. Right at that moment, what were the main pressures concerning the possible help fusion might have given to the community? Why did CERN start this kind of research in a situation where the pressures concerning the production of energy were not so great as today?
I think the pressure to have fusion technology was not as great, but it was foreseen because the demand for energy was increasing. And at that time, there were still no uranium reactors to produce energy. So that was also the same. Like, they came into being in the 60s and 70s, the uranium reactors that we know, as we know them today. So that was still, I would say, a testing phase. So why they came into that, I would say there was interest by physicists who were studying the plasma and continued to do so, by the way. So they didn't stop plasma physics with the accelerators. But why they started is exactly not, I would say, the demand, but they could foresee that this needs to be done. And why they did so, I think, was really to see for more options for CERN, because at that time, '58, the plans at CERN were to complete the proton synchrotron and to study with this machine. It was not the time when they saw, oh, the United States are building a bigger machine, we need the next bigger machine, which was the decision 1 year later. So this was really a changing phase. So I think they were just testing, like, what else could CERN do when they completed the proton synchrotron? What can physicists do in addition to studies at the proton synchrotron? So they just thought plasma physics may be an option. So they started doing this, and you see it in the publications they produced at this department. They really did so. And then they were just put back to other accelerator technologies and producing other devices, bubble chambers, for instance, and things like that. So they kind of that was a phase. I would say maybe it was just a period, like, no one tells you what to do, and physicists just came up with their own ideas in a way, because the planning for the design of the proton synchrotron was completed. So they just did something else with their time. And I think it's also this, like, experimental period, a very short experimental period in history of CERN, which repeated later. And you know it, that I studied, like, why World Wide Web came into being at CERN. It's not a coincidence, but it was also like a short period of experimental freedom, and things just developed in a direction. I think that's also specific for CERN, because it really has this convention of freedom of research. So it allows a lot to do, and I think that's a bit different factors coming together.
Just for the audience, for those who don't know, CERN at the time was a very important project for European integration, for the early attempts to integrate Europe to actually working together in an intergovernmental agency. So CERN had a very important political role at the time, and I mean, in this case, it seems to be that fusion was not within this main political aim of those involved in CERN to have the process of European integration. Was mostly something that appears to be apart from this main goal, right? So there were physicists that were exploring other possibilities for us, for the self-interest of CERN itself, rather than being something that can really help the European integration. But the CERN itself, there were many agreements, many discussions that concern the political role of CERN itself at the time. So I think that there is a big difference there. And there are the questions, but
I could have lost it, so in case, sorry. But I didn't understand if there was like an interest from mass media to this history, let's say, and therefore also a role of a public opinion.
Okay, like this. At that time, you mean?
Yeah.
Yes. So imagine in 58, so I can talk like this, then it works. So in 58, yes, there was mass media interest. And I mean, we need to think in a smaller word that news don't spread via internet, of course. But the conference in Geneva in 58 was quite a public event. So they had exhibitions for the public as well. And the news were all over in the media that this is an important milestone for fusion and for nuclear technology in general. So 3 years earlier, there was another conference in Geneva, the first Atoms for Peace conference, and this already attracted a lot of attention because nuclear technology at that time really generated a lot of hopes of a safe energy, like forever, energies forever for everyone. Like they had ideas to have cars driven by uranium, etc. So like really a lot of fantasies involved. So the mass media also reported about these events, and you see on the pictures like people were really waiting in lines to enter the exhibitions and see the devices. And what they did in 58, for instance, is they built together a whole nuclear reactor in front of the public so they could really see how that thing works, how safe it is, and how easy it is, like how easy it is to build a reactor and things like that. So this was really an interaction with the public that was important. And yes, the newspapers reported about that, like the large newspapers all over the world covered these kind of events, these exhibitions and things. It's similar to world affairs, were super important at that time. And I think today it's a bit different. Today we have like different news channels, mass media is more the internet, and those things are not, I would say, so much centered on one event. But at that time, this conference was really a big thing. That's why it attracted so much attention. So that's why they already started to prepare months before to just for one, like it was a period for 1 week or 2 weeks, and then everything was over again.
There are other questions. I will have a last one if there are no questions. Amy, then you talked about science diplomacy, right? Fusion science diplomacy, fusion diplomacy. Now we have the ITER, the way which there are cooperation between the US, Russian Federation, China, Korea, and India, and so on. So we have a big cooperation which is actually going on at the present moment, in spite of the many technological and competition and actually wars which are behind. So what this case, historical case, is saying about the big team of fusion diplomacy. You're talking about the 1950s. There were the issue that CERN was an instrument also in the science diplomacy framework to build a Western European integration between allies of the United States. So what does it say, your case, for the topic of fusion diplomacy? What was diplomacy involved in this case?
I think it's easier to talk like that. Thanks. That's a great question. So imagine again, Roberto said it to you, like CERN was a model for European integration at that time with 12 member states. They had to send, so the council was representatives of member states, 2 per country. They had to decide what CERN is about. So that was a really important model, and so it is no coincidence that CERN was approached to set up fusion science diplomacy because it was already working so well. So they had the idea to just use it as a model to set up fusion and plasma physics like CERN. So that is, I think, no coincidence. But what we see as a difference, and I would say that's an important thing for historians to study, is that in the field of fusion, things were a bit differently than in high energy physics, because high energy physics kind of started with the implementation of CERN in Geneva in '52, after some years of preparation. In fusion, they kind of tried the same. So they had the idea of an integrated European laboratory, but then decided against it. They decided to go for the national course, which they already started. And I think that's a very interesting thing, because then I would say they started to coordinate between nations, but they didn't really closely collaborate. So it wasn't it wasn't as speedy, I would say, as high energy physics in integrating, collaborating between nations, because there was no central facility. So it just took a longer time and a different course. What we see today is interesting with the example of ITER in France, which is a global collaboration. But still, I mean, it's not global because it's between several countries from the globe. I think it's not a global collaboration, right? It doesn't. Not every country is involved. But what we see there is also how the politics plays in, and how the scientific, how science and diplomacy are sometimes two different things. For example, at ITER, one famous thing is that the United States decided to not contribute any longer because France didn't agree with their war policies at the beginning of the millennium, right? So they were so there you see something that has nothing to do directly with science plays into scientific collaboration. And I think that's very important to take into account, that sometimes let's call it purely political fear, which isn't about science, right? So war isn't directly about science. Let's just keep it simple. So sometimes politics plays into scientific collaboration. Sometimes scientific collaboration can help politics, and sometimes they don't interplay well, right? So in '58, you see a similar, or you see a similar example with this collaboration in plasma physics and fusion, because the United Kingdom, they decided to we don't want to go into this European collaboration with the Euratom, because they were just not member, and they had plans to set up a national laboratory. So they were like, no, we don't want to have too much collaboration, because they just wanted to take their own path. Because why should they collaborate with others? They were the leading nation with the United States and the Soviet Union in fusion. So this is very important to keep in mind. Sometimes nations and countries just have a stronger interest in setting up their own and supporting their own scientific research instead of collaborating with nations that are not as well funded or not as good, just lack the knowledge, the technology, whatever. So this is a case, and I think this is interesting to study also in at the moment, like how does scientific collaboration come into being? What are the factors that promote it? What are the factors that run in counter to it? And politics, especially conflicts between nations, are extremely important. So the Cold War, for instance, right? To take into account if nations want to collaborate or not. If one nation is stronger, why should it collaborate with another nation, right? So this is, I think, an important thing in terms of science diplomacy.
Thank you very much. Other questions or comments? Okay, we can close here. Thanks very much.